Hello everyone and welcome to the fourth series in our Hfss webinars. I'm Nadia Martin, Sales Manager for Product DNA at GS1, and it's my pleasure to be hosting today's session with our guest experts, Andrea Martinez-Inchausti from the British Retail Consortium and Louise Allen from the Food and Drink Federation. The format of today's session is quite different to those that we've done in the past, and it's in direct response to our last webinar on the 7th of June, during which we were inundated with great questions from the 700 plus attendees. However, we ran out of time. Therefore, this morning we're hosting a 1-hour Q&A, kicking off with some of the questions that you've already submitted, and then we'll open up the floor. Before we dive into the main webinar, as ever, I have a little bit of housekeeping to run through. We are recording today's session and you'll be provided with a link to the recording in the post-event email, along with the published Q&A responses from both webinar sessions. We've got about 120 questions to run through today so far. I encourage you to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to submit any new questions, please. And do upvote any questions submitted by others that you'd like to hear the answers to. And Andrea and Louise will do their very best to get through as many as we can in the next 60 minutes. With the housekeeping complete, let's now focus our attention on the issue in hand. For those who weren't able to join us at the last seminar on the 7th of June, it's my pleasure to welcome back both Andrea Martinez-Inchausti, as I've said, from the British Retail Consortium. Andrea is the Deputy Director responsible for food policy at the BRC. This includes labelling and consumer communication, allergen management, compositional standards and diet and nutrition policy. She's worked with the retailers' nutritionists for over 14 years, discussing and implementing provisions such as nutrition and health claims, food information regulation, palm nuts legislation, reformulation initiatives, and Natasha's law on allergens. Andrea also led the joint project with the Department of Health to deliver the front of pack nutrition labelling scheme. She's currently actively working on the implementation on the new provisions restricting price promotions and product placement in store, calories out of home, and TV and online advertising. Joining Andrea is Louise Allen, Senior Executive of Diet and Health at the Food and Drink Federation. Louise's role includes striving for workable, evidence-based diet and health policy for the food and drink industry. In 20 years at the FDF, her work has included helping to shape school and nursery food standards, advising on reformulation policies and folic acid fortification. She is the FDF's lead on UK food and drink advertising rules, including the UK nutrient profiling model and its application, and also works closely with a number of advertising bodies to share knowledge. Welcome both, it's lovely to see you again. With no time to lose, let's kick off with some questions submitted in advance through the registration form today. However, please forgive both myself and Louise, we've both had COVID. So if you have any kind of coughing fits, or we mute ourselves or turn our screens off, you'll know it's to save all of you from the drama. Right, let's get started, shall we? The first question that came in are food supplements in scope? For example, vitamin supplement gummies.
I think that one is for me. So general food supplements, we understand, are out of the scope of the provisions of the regulation. However, there is an entry in the guidance that was produced by the Department of Health and published in April that states that vitamin and mineral food supplements that take the shape of confectionery are in scope. We have challenged, which would suggest that vitamins and mineral supplements in the form of gummy bears would be in scope and within category 4 confectionery. We have challenged these with the Department of Health to explain the rationale. Those type of products are not merchandised as confectionery. They're normally handled by the parents and given in a very discreet manner to children. They contain, the quantity of vitamin and mineral required for the child for the day, etc., etc. It just makes it easy for the child to consume that product as opposed to if it wasn't on that shape. The Department of Health has agreed that they will review that entry, and they're at the moment considering whether to remove it altogether or what they should replace it with. What we have suggested is that any vitamin and mineral which is in the scope of the Directive 2002/46, that covers vitamin and mineral food supplements are out of scope, irrespective of the shape that these products have. But we're waiting for the Department of Health response.
Okay, thank you so much. Moving on to the next question. Although the guidance states that nutritional scores should be calculated on an as sold basis in most cases, if a product absorbs water during cooking, which is dramatic, it has a dramatic impact on the nutritional data, it seems only logical to use as consumed data. The HFSS score otherwise does not reflect the nutrients being consumed. Who would like to take this one?
That's probably one for me, Nadia. Yeah, the guidance does say you have to calculate the nutrient profiling score on the information as sold in pretty much all cases, except for things that have to be reconstituted before consumption. So things like custard powders, which obviously I don't believe are in scope of this, but if you're looking at advertising to children, they are. So custard powders, jellies, cake mixes, etc.
Okay, lovely. Thank you so much.
If I can add something, sorry, to that question, sorry. What I would say is that I sympathize with the reason why the question has been asked, because indeed we used to go back, or we tend to go back and forth on both, not only whether the product or the MPM has to be or should logically be calculated on as sold or as consumed, but also whether the nutrition information for those type of products should be given on as sold or as consumed on the label. It is much more helpful for the consumer to see the nutrition information on the product that they are going to consume, as opposed to nutrition information on a product which is uncooked, which has to go through a cooking process before you then consume. I think the vast majority of us, me included, having worked on these for a long time, cannot necessarily understand the loss of water, the concentration of some of the nutrients, and the effect that therefore that would have on the overall nutrition preparation of that product. The rationale why they ask for the information to be calculated as unsold is, or on as sold, is for consistency, because on a joined, well, majority of people tend to put it in the oven. However, you might lose more water if you cook it for longer, because that is the way that you actually like that type of meat. But there are other type of products, and one example is sausages, even though, again, it's not a product that is in the scope, but if you look at sausages, you can grill them, you can fry them, you can put them in the oven, and it will have a different effect on the final nutrition composition of the product. So even though I 100% agree that it would make more sense both for the nutrition information and therefore for the calculation to be done on as consumed, for the purpose of the information being more relevant to the customer, the reason why they've chosen as consumed is for consistency. So you are comparing a like by like pre-cooking when everybody could actually provide different cooking instructions, and therefore end up with, you start with the same product, but you end up with a slightly different nutrition composition. So that is the logic behind it, even though, you know, at first glance, it might not necessarily make all that much sense.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for adding to that. I will take the next question. When will this be implemented? The 1st of October. If you need any information, please go back and watch some of the previous webinars that we've done, because there's a lot of data and a lot of knowledge that's been shared around when it's launching, how it's launching, etc.
I would like to add something to that as well. Sorry. We are in conversations with the Department of Health, who is trying to understand how far have we got on the implementation of the provisions of the regulation. And there is a possibility, although the date of application of the regulation will not change, and it is that set in the law, which is the 1st of October of this year for the provisions of product placement, both in store and on website. But for the provisions on volume promotions is the 1st of October next year. Some retailers have chosen voluntarily to apply them this year. The provisions, so that will not change. There are some discussions to understand whether retailers, not manufacturers, but retailers, are given a little bit more time for the purpose of formatting stores. And that is the only area that they're currently, because it does take a long time, and providing that all the bases are set in place, we might be given what we are normally described as enforcement pragmatism to allow all of those plans to be rolled out. But the plan has to be in place, the understanding of your product nature has to be in place as well. So these will be a little bit more leeway for retailers to get all those plans in place a little bit after the 1st of October this year, but it won't be long, and it will just be, as I said, just to roll the plans that are already in place, not necessarily to start calculating scores for products.
Louise, your hand is up.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that as well. Obviously, we're talking about England here, and just a bit of a nod to what's happening in Wales and in Scotland. If you hadn't heard, there are consultations on the promotion of products in store out at the moment. They close in September, and there are slight differences to mechanisms and products in scope and the areas in scope as well. So it gets even more confusing. And I think we should also say, obviously, when we're talking about, when we're talking here, we're talking about England. But if you manufacture in Wales or Scotland or wherever, if you sell the product, then obviously the rules do apply in England.
Fantastic. Thanks so much for that clarification. The next question. There's a lot of confusion regarding products that come with sauce and glaze. Due to the wording of legislation and supporting interpretation documents, it's hard to interpret what considerable amount of liquid means. Is there a percentage value of sauce which we can use as a guide?
First of all, I agree that there is confusion. The previous guidance talked about if the product is presented with a marinade or a glaze is out of scope. However, if it is presented with the sauce, is within scope. Now, we all know that some of that terminology is used interchangeably. So a lot of people and we provided the Department of Health with a lot of examples of the same product being described in a slightly different way, given that there isn't a legal description for a marinade or a sauce as such. In the final guidance, the Department of Health had stated, and I'm just going to read from it because it's easier, that marinades and glazes are out of scope, and a sauce will be considered a product which, after cooking, leaves a significant liquid remaining, which can be poured over the food. So that is what they mean by sauce as opposed to a marinade. However, there's been a couple of questions in the chat about juices that are the result of cooking a joined or fresh meat would always normally release an element of juice. We don't believe that to be classified as a sauce as such, even if you can make gravy out of it or you have a residue that you can pour over the product. I think the concept is that if the sauce, marinade, glaze, however you want to call it, that you add or that the raw product contains is left in significant residue, or you have a significant quantity that you can pour over the product in once the product is cooked, then that would deem the product to be in scope, not necessarily the juice or the sauce that results from the cooking of fresh meat or fish. So it's just related to whatever was there in the first place. If it remains, instead of being dried and absorbed by the meat of the product or the muscle, it remains in the product, then that is to be considered as a sauce. We toyed with the idea when we were developing our own guidance of setting up a threshold, and we did talk about the threshold of something that is between 20 and 25% or above the overall weight of the product would be considered to be a sauce. But we decided against it because it was felt that that residue, providing that you understand that it relates to the original sauce or glaze, not necessarily, again, what it is produced as a result of juices coming from the muscle of the meat or the fish, was, if not clear enough for the purpose of establishing what's in and what's out.
Fantastic, thank you so much. Oh, this is a real minefield, part of the legislation. We do sympathise. This next question, how to calculate nutritional information for fruit and veg in a product. Louise did an absolutely incredible session on the 7th of June. Please go back and watch the second half of the recording. Well, watch all of Louise's recording. We split the recording into two. There is a very detailed explanation as to how you calculate your score. So we're not going to cover that in detail today. Okay. Next question. What classes as a dried nut? As a multiplier of 2 is added to this, do whole and freeze-dried fruits and dried fruits and veg count as they have a multiplier of 2 attached to them? If they're then grounded, are they out of scope? And what is the level of data that you need in order to support whether a product is out of scope? For example, in a savoury biscuit. That wasn't read out very well. I apologise, everybody.
Right, that sounds like it's for me. I'm quite excited. I do actually have some information for you on this, which I'm really excited about. I only found out yesterday. So I have a contact who has been part of nutrient profiling development since sort of day one. And he confirms, particularly like freeze-dried fruits, yes, they count. They can be counted twice, but when you if you use them as powder, then that would not be classed as minimally processed, so you would not be able to count them, which does sound a little bit counterintuitive, because I would say that if you have a freeze-dried fruit and you powder it, you're not going to get any nutrient loss, but that is basically his view, and he is obviously the expert on this, so I think we'd have to go with that. But nowhere in the guidance does it say anything about freeze-dried fruit, so we just have to go on the information that we've got. In terms of nuts, again, my same contact and the fruit, veg and nut guidance doesn't really say much of the guidance doesn't say much about dried nuts. My contact has said, really, you should count nuts just once, count them all as fresh. The rationale behind that he didn't say, but I would think it's because when you dry fruit and vegetable, there's a significant amount of water loss and obviously a higher concentration of the nutrients, and I don't think you get the same effect when you dry nuts. So yeah, count once. What was the other question? Sorry.
If the ground, you've done that, what's the level of data that we need in order to support whether the product is out of scope? We can come, don't worry, we can come back to that. We've got so many questions to plough through, so let's move on. Application of the nutritional promotion calculations in a liquid medium when reconstitution is needed before consumption. Somebody said they're not able to join the call, but I don't feel like that's got quite enough content in the question for you to be able to answer it. Do you agree?
Just calculate as consumed if it has to be reconstituted.
Okay, calculate as consumed. Lovely. Yeah. Somebody's asked, as far as I can see, products that we supply, cheese and cheese with added ingredients, do not fall within the scope of HFSS legislation. Do you agree?
Yes. So cheese as such is out of scope, and cheese with additions, that would be, for example, cheese with cranberries or cheese with all of those sort of things, would be out of scope. Yeah, not one of the categories covered.
Thank you. So based on the mention of generating a new barcode for products that change their recipe, considering that by changing the recipe, there will be a change in the packaging, my question is this: would it not be better to add a logo onto the front of the packaging where it mentions the product is in or out of scope? This would help consumers make their own decision when purchasing the product. I think this is one thing that we covered in a previous seminar, is that HFSS, it is very much an industry-led initiative and legislation, and although consumers are starting to hear about it, it's not part of their vernacular, which is why there is no drive for HFSS labelling to be on product. Is that still the same position, Louise, Andrea?
We have looked very, very briefly. We haven't actually gone into any detail just yet, at the concept or possibility of potentially adding something on the label, which is not necessarily consumer focused, to identify products which are indeed Hfss or not. These would be because, or if that was to go ahead, and I said this is very preliminary stages, we have not done any detailed work at the moment, there's too much going on, but we are mindful that this is the first piece of, or one of the very first pieces of legislation, which puts a lot of pressure on store colleagues. And while we're here talking about the thousands of products that have to be NPM'd and the thousands of products for which we have to make a decision on whether it's in scope or out of scope, we're talking about, well, is a residue of sauce, you know, big enough or small enough, etc. We all have a lot more resources, capabilities, time. It is within our job specs to be able to do this type of work. The colleagues that are in a store are very busy. They have a lot of jobs. And on the top of that, now they're going to have to be presented with, and we haven't yet decided, many retailers are looking into how do they communicate to the store manager and therefore to the rest of colleagues in the store, what are they able to place in some of the restricted areas of a store? Do we provide a positive list? Do we provide a negative list? Do we provide, do we change the list on a weekly basis? Or how is that then communicated? It is made even more complicated by the fact that they are products which are big sellers and they tend to be big impulse sellers. Therefore, we want to continue to place in predominant and prominent areas of the store, something like hot cross buns, where based on the MP, which we know are in scope of the cakes category or the morning goods category, but some of them, if you run the NPM, some hot cross buns would be Hfss, some hot cross buns would not be Hfss. So again, how to communicate with colleagues in store and make sure that they get it right, that 50% of the hot cross bun offering is in scope versus 50% is not in scope. We can make the decision of saying we're not going to place any in the predominant area. But as I said, commercially, that is not something that is very helpful. So we have considered, and as I said, very preliminary, including something on the pack that will help colleagues in store understand what products are potentially in scope or not, so they can check it in a similar way that they check durability dates. But it would not be to be communicated to the customer. And I think it is very important that the customer continues to understand the front of pack messaging. We've just had a question about cheese. Although high in calcium, and it is a lovely product to consume, it is one of those products that has to be consumed in moderation for everybody in the population, including children. So for the purpose, it would be a Hfss food, however, not covered in the provisions of these regulations. So how would you work that one out? Would still want the consumer to understand that the product has to be consumed in moderation, and there is many products that in which that would be the case, yet they haven't been for reasons, some of which are clear, some of which are not, included in the scope of these regulations. So yeah, I think the consumer communication part, I'm not too comfortable about. The including something on the label that is succinct, not necessarily aiming at consumers, but might help colleagues in store, is a possibility, not necessarily in the near future, but potentially something a little bit longer term to help us manage these provisions.
Fantastic, thank you so much. I'm going to try and read a few questions that hopefully have a yes/no answer so that we can get through a few. Just looking at the Q&A, would a salt set be classed as in scope or out of scope?
Sorry, I didn't understand.
I think like a grinding salt is what's being asked for the people around.
Like a condiment, out of scope.
Out of scope, lovely. Does the recent Kellogg's ruling also support that the NPM score should be sold as sold rather than as consumed?
I mean, sadly, looks like that is the case, and very disappointing, obviously, for Kellogg's. But I guess that's what the law, that's what the ruling has said. So I guess we're going to have to live with it.
Yeah, I don't think we should tell too much.
Yeah. But
I think it is more.
Just to know, actually, yeah. So even oats, you have to you have to use the nutrition information as sold as well, because of, I guess there's so many different ways to eat them, even instant oat sachets.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. I know that it's a little bit controversial to ask those sorts of questions, but I think there are some people who would like the answer. So thank you. Are the regulations online live from October as well?
Correct. That's correct. Yeah. So from the 1st of October, online has to be complied with.
Lovely.
Correct.
Is processed cereal-based baby foods, are they in or out of scope?
So the guidance make it clear that they are a number of products on the baby side that are out of scope, and these are those that are covered by regulations on infant formula, follow-on formula, baby foods, and cereal-based products for infants and babies. So if your product is covered by the provisions of those regulations, it will be out of scope. If it is not covered by those regulations, it would be in scope.
Okay, lovely. Something I think, Louise, you've already covered on. Our company's based in Northern Ireland, but we supply to retail chains, etc. in England. How does the new legislation affect our company? Shall I save you that one and say, if you are selling into any retailer in England, you are, no matter where you manufacture, you are affected by this legislation. I think
it is important to understand that the companies that are in scope are retailers. So the manufacturer is in scope by provision of providing food to a retailer, but the provisions apply at retail level. So if the retailer is selling your food, it is where the retailer is based that will determine whether your product is in scope or not. So that is a way of thinking it. A manufacturer is not either in scope or not, is the retailer that is, and if they're selling your product, unfortunately, you are by default having to provide the information because they'll have to understand how to display it.
Am I right in saying that if you, so the size of the business as well is based on the retailer, not the manufacturer?
Correct.
Yeah, I was about to say, there's a question, how does the HFSS legislation impact small businesses with under 50 employees? So again, it's if you are a small business who's manufacturing, but you are selling into a retailer in England that is affected by the legislation, you too are affected by the legislation because you're having to provide them with information. Lovely, thank you. Please can you confirm if sandwich fillers and dips are within scope, and if so, which category do they fall under? We're getting quite precise questions, but that's
out of
part
scope.
of the Q&A.
Out of scope. They're not products that are within the scope of it. It's not one of the 13 categories. It's not part of 13. I think there is even a reference to sandwich fillers being out of scope in the guidance for category 13, so out of scope.
Lovely. There are two sets for the AOAC, one which includes soluble only and one which includes insoluble. Is there any guidance on which method is to be used, as concerns about testing and incorrect results have been used by both calculating HFSS, oh goodness, I've put in a few too many S's there, sorry, and report nutrition on the back?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I can take that one. The guidance does say use the English method where possible. However, the guidance was written many, many years ago, and I think the most commonly used approach now is AOAC, because this is consistent with Europe and the US, and is consistent with the Codex definition, which was developed as well, which recognises all the extra components of the fibre. So I would say it is quite confusing to have two figures for fibre when you look at the guidance. But yeah, for nutrition labelling purposes as well, I would say it's all AOAC.
Thank you so much. We make an Indian curry sauce, mango chutney, lime pickles, pasta sauce, and other table sauces. Does the product, or do these products fall under HFSS?
Table sauces out of scope as well, so they're not covered in the 13 categories.
Okay, lovely. I'll just try and get a couple of questions that have come in this morning. Are instant noodles with seasoning made up with water within or out of scope?
Out of the scope. They're specifically listed out of the scope in the guidance. So they would naturally be in category 13, but they're specifically listed as out of scope.
Okay, Daniel Jones, we use concentrated fruit juices, which has not been reconstituted up again, but is made of 100% fruit juice. Does this get treated like a concentrated tomato puree and get doubled in the FV and N's calculation for the HFSS score?
Great question. The guidance does not talk about concentrated fruit juices. It does talk about fruit juices, so you can count them. They are classed as minimally processed. If you're using simply something that's been extracted, so like a fruit juice sugar, powder or leather, you can't count that. But if it's purely 100% fruit juice, you can count it. For precautionary measures, because there's nothing in the guidance to suggest this, I would say count the weight once.
Okay. The next question might be a little bit tricky, and by all means defer if you need to. Online shopping in Scotland, how does this work for customers in England?
So as Louise alluded, we have 2 consultations that are out at the moment in both Wales and Scotland. And we also understand that Northern Ireland is a little bit behind, but they're looking at the possibility of potentially develop provisions in this area as well. The majority of businesses have one website and one website only, and that website they're looking to make compliant with the provisions in England. So it is a very good question, and one that we are going to be actively discussing with the governments in Wales and Scotland, who are currently developing the provisions of their own national regulations, because it would be difficult enough to have to implement different provisions in the physical stores in the different areas of the country. But from a website perspective, it would not be possible. It would be incredibly difficult. And as we have unfortunately discovered with things like Brexit, etc., we do know that there are many stores that are located in borders, etc., etc. So we know practicality wise, there are many people who are shopping on a Scottish website, but they're located in England or the other way around. And the same applies to Northern Ireland and the Republic, etc., etc. So logistics of the physical stores are already difficult enough. Online, it would just not be possible. So that is the basis of a lot of the conversations that we're going to be having with a lot of the governments at the moment. What I would say, however, is that the national websites that all of my members run would be moving to be compliant, irrespective of where you're actually purchasing this product from the 1st of October. What we would want is for that to be sufficient in the other countries as well, or with minor tweaks to be compliant nationally. What we cannot do, and we will try to really push very hard against, is having to have different websites for the different for the 4 different UK countries.
Yeah, absolutely. We have to make it practical. Right, let's ping through a few quick ones. Are protein bars in or out of scope?
Quick ones.
Sorry.
Protein. The guidance and the regulations state that some protein bars are in scope of the regulation. They include some very, very top-line criteria to establish whether the protein bars, would be in or not. And some of it relates to where they're displayed in store, as well as its composition. So one of the things it states is, if the protein bar includes or contains within its composition ingredients that one would naturally associate with a confectionery bar, then they would be in scope. However, they do not go any further in explaining what might be an ingredient that you would naturally characterize confectionery with. So it's not really very helpful. What we have done in our guidance, in the BRC guidance, is go a little bit further, and we've included a number of ingredients which we are not necessarily saying if your product contains these is 100% in or 100% out, but that might give you an understanding. So if your product contains something like chocolate, toffee, fudged, and those type of ingredients, you are likely to be looking at what they normally describe a protein bar that is classified as a confectionery bar and therefore in scope, as opposed to something that is not in scope. the guidance document, not only for protein bars, for other type of products, talks about where the product is merchandised in store. And the difficulty with these criteria is that many stores merchandise things in many different ways. So it depends a little bit on the retailer, it depends on the specific size of the store, etc. So by and large, it is a rule that retailers are not taking very serious as part of the criteria to establish what is in and out of scope. I think compositional elements are the ones that we think should more strongly drive this decision as opposed to product placement criteria.
Okay, thank you so much. I'll try not to pretend something's going to be quick. Are flavoured burgers, for example, cheeseburgers packed with no bun, in or out of scope?
We believe they're out of scope. So the guidance says that a patty or equivalent, whether meat-based or plant-based, are out of scope. From the moment that you offer them pre-pack and with a bun, they're in scope. Although it is a little bit confusing again, because sandwiches are out of scope and a burger is just a sandwich with a patty inside in so many ways. But the guidance specifically states that burgers in a bun are in scope.
Okay. Jams, chocolate spreads, peanut butter, etc. Are these within scope?
Out of the scope.
Out of scope. Okay, let's revert back to our piece of paper. Will hard cheese continue to be price promoted under the new regulations?
It can be price promoted because it's out of scope. Yeah.
Okay. Oh, this is a little bit specific about a particular retailer. Will Sainsbury's continue to feature butter spreads, cheese promotions on plinth end? I don't think anyone on this webinar is able to answer on behalf of Sainsbury's.
Absolutely.
Apologies to whoever.
No. I mean, what I would say more generically is that these products are not covered in scope. So Sainsbury's and every other retailer has the capability of doing that, whatever their plans are and how they're moving to implement these provisions. Obviously, it is down to each individual company, but they are not restricted by the provisions of the regulation.
Okay, so a question that was raised during the first seminar that was left unanswered, I'm not sure if you two were involved actually in the very first seminar, but will brioche burger buns fall within the scope of HFSS legislation and restrictions under the breakfast bakery as confirmed in scope? But they're not really eaten, this is saying, as a breakfast option, whereas single serve pain au chocolat and croissants as well, will they fall in scope or out of scope? So
we believe they're in scope, and we have had some discussions with the Department of Health to this nature. And we believe they're in scope for a number of reasons. One's because they contain sugar in their composition, and that makes them equivalent in some ways, although they don't contain sugar to the same degree, they are equivalent to some of the other morning goods in composition. Two, we have to understand what led to some of the provisions of this regulation, and that is the criteria that was used by Public Health England on their sugar reduction strategy. And in that strategy, they made clear that brioche buns were in scope of the morning goods reformulation morning good category. But three, I was of your same understanding that these are not consumed for breakfast, but I was corrected in saying that many of them are stuffed with bacon and consumed as a bacon butty for breakfast. And that is apparently a new trend, very active in the market at the moment. So they are in some cases consumed as a morning good. They're quite versatile and they're not always consumed for breakfast, but they can be consumed for breakfast. But really, I think it's composition and the logic of why they ended up in this category led us to include them. And we've clarified that in our guidance. And that is something that has been confirmed by the Department of Health. So we do believe they're in scope.
Thank you so much. With the HFS items with high scores included within gift hampers, would this be within scope? I know that we covered this, Louise, you covered this quite a bit in the previous webinar, but would you like to quickly recap?
Yeah, I didn't catch the first bit of the question, but for hampers, if you have one HFSS item in the hamper, the whole hamper will fall in scope of the restrictions. That includes, even if you've got some non-food items or some alcohol items in there, if you've got an HFSS product, then you can't put it in these locations in England.
Thank you. Something specifically for you, Andrea, how often will the BRC guidance on categories be updated? How do you feedback on any information in there that they believe to be inaccurate?
So we haven't decided the regularity with which we're going to be updating it, but we will review it again before the 1st of October. And the process at the moment is just simply, please drop me an email with your views, or if you believe something is incorrect or something that we have to review, I would be very happy to put it to the group and consider any changes to the document.
Okay, lovely. Going back to our initial questions before the seminar, a roast in the bag joint with seasoning marinade glaze where excess juices will form is placed on the pack, as a suggestion only, is placed on the pack to utilize the cooking juices for a gravy. So this comes back, I think, to the questions you answered in the beginning about sauces, glazes, juices that come off, you know. Just a very quick recap, because there's a few questions around meat. So if a steak is cooked with salted and flavored butter, within the instruction, do you add, and adding the butter partway through the cooking, spooning over when you're serving? Can you summarize all of those sort of meat questions?
So our understanding is that naturally any fresh meat and fish, when cooked, will release some juices. Those are not regarded as a sauce, even though you could use that liquid for the development or creation of a sauce or a gravy later on. What one has to understand is if the product as purchased contains either a sachet or is glazed or has sauce in any form, and that sauce is not absorbed in the muscle of the meat of the fish and has a residue at the end of the cooking process, that will be deemed to be in scope. But actually a sauce or a liquid, which is the result of the release from cooking the mussel, we don't believe will be deemed to be a sauce and therefore trigger the product to be in scope.
Okay, fantastic. As a supplier, is providing HFSS scores to retailers based on as sold nutrition a requirement or just advised?
The technical guidance is guidance, but it's a requirement.
It's a requirement. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. SDIL compliant fruit juice based soft drinks sweetened only with stevia and fruit juice, no added sugar, in or out of scope?
So I believe the Department of Health has done a bit of a disservice in making a reference to the soft drink levy within the body of the guidance document, because I don't think the two correlate clearly. What the document states is that if you have a soft drink and that contains either added sugar or added sweeteners, which is stevia is an added sweetener, if your product is HFSS, then it will be within the scope of the regulation, I'm afraid. So you might have a product quite feasibly that does not have to pay the levy. So it's not within the scope of the soft drink levy. And we have a number of examples of that, which is within the scope of this regulation.
Wonderful, thank you very much. What about charcuterie, cold meats, in or out?
Out of the scope. It is clarified again within the guidance document as part of category 13.
Okay, I'm turning back to some of the questions posed this morning. Ready to eat products involving fish, e.g. trout, pate, caviar, cold smoked trout, in or out of scope?
Out of those that have been listed out of scope.
Okay. Let me go back. Are sweet biscuits, cakes and donuts in scope even without any promotion or packaging? Promotion on packaging, forgive me.
If they don't have any packaging, so if they are not pre-packed as defined by the Food Information Regulation, so this is Regulation 1169/2011, they are not in scope, but from the moment that they are packed, they would be in scope.
So it doesn't matter about promotion, it's the physical, if they are wrapped, they are in scope.
Well, it's a bit of a catch-22. So if they're in scope, they cannot be promoted.
Yeah, okay.
right?
Oh, it's right.
And if they're not in scope, then they can be promoted.
Okay, that was really, thank you very much. That clarification is actually really important. I'm trying not to, I believe butter, spreads and cheese are out of scope exempt. Can we continue to promote such products within feature and gondola end spaces within major malts?
Indeed, yeah, you can.
You can, lovely. I'm trying not to repeat myself. Can we use consumed HFSS values for cooking pastes, which has to be reconstituted before it's used?
Without knowing the type of product, it's difficult to say. If it has to be reconstituted before it's used, then you use it as it's consumed. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Yeah, okay. We produce a raspberry, coulis and mango and passionate fruit compotes. Do they class as fruit fillings or dessert toppings, and are they in scope?
Interesting. Likely to be. So it will depend a little bit on whether they are to be, or they can be consumed as, how are they presented? So are they to be consumed as such, or are they to be an ingredient in a dessert? Would potentially trigger whether they're in scope or not. My feeling is they're likely to be a dessert and therefore in scope. It's very difficult without knowing the specific nature of the product, but the regulation does state the majority of the ingredients that go into desserts, if they're not naturally consumed as such, tend to be out of scope, but if they can be consumed as such, they would therefore, they would be in scope. So likely to be in scope.
Okay, I've just seen another question about brioche burger buns. I think we've covered that, Catalina, sorry. Somebody's asked, do the rules depend on the MPM score? What is the score for?
Yeah, the rules do apply, do rely on the MPM score. And if you look at the previous GS1 webinar, I do go through this in a little bit more detail, but if your HFSS score is 4 or more, if you're a food, then you're in scope. If it's a drink and it's 1 or more, then you're also in scope.
Yeah, so I think it is important to understand that to establish whether your food is in or out of scope, there's 3 criteria, all of which have to be met. The product has to be pre-packed. If it is loose, it's out of scope, irrespective of anything else. So pre-packed. 2, it has to be covered within one of the 13 categories and be in the scope of those 13 categories. And then it has to be HFSS. So you might have a product like a pizza, which is pre-packed and in one of those categories, but if it scores below 4, then it's out of scope. You reversely might have a product that, like cheese, as we've described, which scores above 4, but because it's not covered in one of the 13 categories, is out of scope. So all of those 3 criteria will have to apply at the same time for your product to be in scope.
Wonderful. Okay. As we said, this legislation is a bit of a minefield, and you know, if you need extra sort of support or you want to ask any questions and we don't get through them today, you can always email Andrea and Louise directly, or take a look at the websites. Is ready to bake cookie dough in scope? And if so, which category?
We believe it is, and it will depend on what ready to bake product it is. So a ready to bake pain de chocolat, then it will be a morning good. If it is a ready to bake cookie dough, I think was the question, it will be within cookies in the biscuit category.
Okay, we have covered this already, this next question, but I think it's still coming up as a question, so maybe we'll try and be a little bit more clear. We manufacture cake products in Northern Ireland, but supply to Scotland and England. Remember, everybody, the legislation at the moment is just for England on the 1st of October of this year. How does this HFSS regulation affect us? So manufacturing outside of England, but you are selling within England or to retailers within England and soon at some point in Scotland, you are affected. You need to provide your HFSS score to the retailers. Is there anything else you'd like to add, ladies?
You're correct, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Would you still be classed as a specialist online shop if you sell multiple specialist items, e.g. you're a confectionist, chocolatier and sell non-food, but nearly all items are in scope and have a high HFSS score? So from a retailer side of things.
This is one, again, that we continue to discuss with the Department of Health, because the regulation does not refer to a specialist store. The regulation provides two exemptions. It provides an exemption for stores that have a small square footage below 2,000 square feet, and for stores that predominantly sell products within one category. Now, what we have stated to the Department of Health is that, well, we understand, and I know they have chocolatiers in mind when they were developing these provision, but what we've stated to the Department of Health is that they may be shops, like delicatessen shops, etc., which sell more than one category, that would still struggle with the concept of having the right space to be able to display some of these products. So you could think of a sweet shop which also sells ice cream, for example, or an element of cake or biscuits. They will sell 4 categories as opposed to just one. The definition of predominantly, again, it is unclear and has not been clarified within the regulation. Is it on number of SKUs? Is it on volume of sales? Does it have to be defined at a given point in time or throughout the year? Because you might not retail and sell the same items in the summer as you would do in the winter. So I'm afraid to say that what the law says is that you are exempt if you predominantly sell products from one category. It doesn't specify whether it is one of the covered categories in the annex or not. But we are challenging this concept because we believe it is a bit too narrow, and the same restriction of space would apply in both for sometimes websites, but also for in-store. What I would say on the website is that if you can, try to avoid the provisions as far as you can. So you can include imagery, you can include many elements of your product within the homepage, etc. But there are some restrictions about whether you can actually place the item directly from the homepage onto your basket, etc., etc. So I would say it is slightly easier as an specialist store to comply with the provisions online, even though you have to give some thought to them, that it is in store where you physically might not have the space to actually move certain items to different areas of the store. But the question said that the specific retailer had things like, for example, non-food. So again, as not covered by the regulation, you might want to play with the location of those items versus, you know, the specific food that is covered within the regulation.
Okay, thank you so much. Right, I'm conscious of time. Can you clarify that pre-packed sweet biscuits are in scope, but PPDS are out of scope?
That's correct. So pre-pack in scope, loose or pre-pack for direct sale, out of scope.
Okay, are savoury biscuits in scope in totality, or are there specific SKU exemptions?
I believe that the majority are out of the scope. However, you have to be mindful of category 2 on savory snacks, because that category states that products, which could include savory biscuits, that are consumed in a similar way or as alternative to crisps, would be in scope. So you just have to make sure that you understand whether your savory biscuit is consumed as an alternative to a crisp, or it is to be, broadly speaking, consumed, for example, with a piece of cheese, and that is what the general presentation of the product would entice you to do.
Okay, we sell a ready-to-eat tray of 6 gyros with dipping sauce. It is sold within the sandwiches and lunch items. However, it can also be heated and consumed hot. Would this fit into category 13?
If I understand correctly, you just mentioned that you have a tray with an array of dippings.
So the gyoza that you dip in?
Oh, the gyoza, sorry. We believe, so the category 13 states that it mainly covers main meals or meal centers. Now, these type of roasted gyoza tend to be presented as side dish or a starter. And I think on those bases, I would say that they are likely to be out of scope.
I apologise, I put myself on mute. Nutritional results for the retailer are based on analytical results. Analytical results can be plus or minus 20% of the calculated results. Is there guidance on this, please?
Not based on the nutrition profiling guidance, no. What I would say is that obviously for your nutrition information on pack, there is a certain amount of tolerance either way, which complies with food information regulation. So I think if you use that, I think you can justify the result to primary authorities. I don't know if Andrea knows any more on that.
Yeah, well, it's one of the questions that we've asked of the Department of Health to clarify, but I think Louise is right. The majority of MPM scores would be based on the nutrition information that is provided on pack or the analytical nutrition information. We know that there is a broad tolerance of 20%, but actually it's a bit more difficult because the tolerance relates to the size of it relates to each nutrient, and it also relates to the figure. So the higher, the larger the tolerance, etc., etc. Yes, I think you could argue that it could be somebody who is not very onerous and is using that 20% tolerance to get their product in. We're hoping that the majority of people would be fair and would use that tolerance for what it's used, which is the capability to understand what the capability of the method is. We were just talking about fiber, and we know that the methods are notorious for being difficult and bringing in some uncertainty. So that was the reason for what the tolerance was actually set. That is the nature on which we hope the suppliers would be using that information, and therefore, the scores would not be affected. But we do know of cases where nutrition information has been challenged in the past by an enforcement authority, and so could be the case of score being challenged on the basis that the nutrition information had been challenged. And in, I believe, the vast majority of those cases, both brand and retailer have been successful in providing information back that shows that they were operating within the limits of the law by the fair use of those tolerances, to be able to understand that there is sometimes some variability in the methodology. I also know that sometimes the tolerances are being used, for example, to allow for reformulation during a period of time. If you've reduced, let's say, sugar by 5%, you might not want to reflect that on the pack until the next run. So you would have some, for example, different values that you are aware of and that you might be passing on to the retailer, which might not necessarily coincide with the information on pack. So again, that is another use of the tolerance. But yeah, we hope that everybody will use them in the way in which they're meant to be used, but yeah, that's what they're there for.
Go ahead, Louise.
Can I add to that? I was asked about NutriCal and whether you can use that. And having done a little bit of research, it does look like it's trading standards approved. So I would say you could use that. In the nutrient profiling guidance, specifically, it talks about milk and the fact that there can be some seasonal and geographical variations, and it does advise that Mercanson-Widdowson is another good source that you can use if you're struggling to work out, particularly if you've got something where you're trying to work out as consumed, and you need to work out the milk content.
Okay. We're rapidly running out of time, but are ambient freeze pops classed as in or out of scope?
We believe they're in scope.
They're in scope. Again, I'm trying to pick something that is going to be a 1 second answer. I do apologise, everybody. Are pre-cooked meatballs in or out of scope?
On the basis that sausages are out of a scope, I would say meatballs are likely to be out of a scope as well.
I think I can end on this one. Does this regulation only consider consumed products as opposed to cosmetic and beauty products? Let's finish on a definite
definition of food according to food, the general food safety regulation. So it would be food only. Now, there is certain cosmetics or something that is retailed in the cosmetic aisle that sometimes could be classed as food as well. So just be careful with those. But actually, is the definition, there's a clear legal definition for food, and that is what it's used in as the basis for this regulation.
Fantastic. Well, I've got to say we've covered quite a lot of ground today. Thank you so much. I'm afraid that we have run out of time. I just want to say again, Andrea and Louise, thank you so much. Louise, I hope you recovered quickly.
You too.
We will
Pleasure.
be sending out, so any additional questions, we will try and answer those offline for you. And we will also be sending out a link to this webinar, and you'll also be able to get access to our previous webinars. So I believe that's all that there is to say. And thank you very much, everybody, for joining us. Thank you for your great questions as ever. Take care.
Thank
Farewell.
you. Bye-bye.